to the kind of last session of papers. Then there'll be a plenary and a screening. We are running behind today, but we'll keep to the programme in terms of the content. So just, yeah, we'll go straight to dinner at the end of the day. I will introduce the speakers one by one. On this last session on David Medalla, with papers from David Dibosa, Eva Bentcheva and Sonia Boyce. David has already had an introduction, so I won't inflate his ego anymore by giving him a but I will pass over to David for his paper, Ambivalent Thresholds, David Medalla's Conceptualism and Queer British Art. The floor is yours, David.
Thanks very much. I'm just going to read my paper without much introduction, so with your permission, just please bear with me. As long as everybody can hear me. Yeah, that's great. Okay, Ambivalent Thresholds, David Medalla's Conceptualism and Queer British Art. Setting the scene. In April 2017, a new exhibition, Queer British Art 1861 to 1967, opened at Tate Britain, London, to coincide with the 50th anniversary of the decriminalisation of male homosexuality in Britain. The exhibition focused on art production in Britain during the 100 years prior to decriminalisation. It contained highlights such as paintings by Simeon Solomon, including Love Dreaming by the Sea, 1871, drawn from the 19th century, and works by David Hockney, including Berta vers alias Burney, from 1961, drawn from the 20th century. One of the later works in the show was Cloud Canyons No. 3, an ensemble of bubble machines, auto-created sculptures from 1961. The artwork is a sculptural piece by David Medalla. Medalla was born in the Philippines in 1942. He started living in Britain in 1960, although since that time he has spent periods of time living in several different countries. A key point to note about Medalla's work was its positioning. It was installed some 2.5 meters or so beyond the exit of the exhibition. The distance of the work from the main body of the exhibition has led to observations, albeit anecdotal, that some viewers were not even aware that David Medalla's sculpture formed part of the Queer British Art show. Given that Medalla was the only non-white artist in the exhibition, a series of concerns must be raised. In this paper, I take the problematic positioning of Medalla's sculpture within the British Art show as symptomatic of a deeper problem with the positioning of Medalla within British art historical discourse. I will not give this afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, a detailed analysis of the Tate Britain exhibition, but rather what I want to do is to look at the historical context of post-war British sculpture, aiming to get a closer understanding of Medalla's positioning within the British art historical traditions. I start with Guy Brett, who has written, and I quote, "Although he has worked in Britain for more than 30 years, Medalla is not readily perceived as belonging to the British, nor for that matter, to the Filipino art world," end quote. So my discussion asks whether that problematic position of David Medalla, the person, has had an impact on the positioning of David Medalla's artwork. Let me start with a careful description of Cloud Canyons for those of you who do not know the work. First made in 1961, Cloud Canyons No. 3, an ensemble of bubble machines, is a sculptural construction consisting of metal, perspex, and machine parts. its dimensions are variable. The entire work sits on a wooden base. The machine parts, compressors and timers, are located in the lower part of the sculpture. Above the base sits a bath of soapy water from which perspex tubes rise from the centre of the piece. A cylindrical construction around 230 centimetres in diameter, made of riveted metal sheets, covers the bath as well as the bottom of the tubes, acting as a form of lid. A single circular aperture, approximately 70 centimetres in diameter, appears in the centre of the top of the lid. Through this opening, the perspex tubes can be seen to rise. The circular opening also allows viewers to see the surface of the soapy water solution in the bath, if you peer over. So in total, 5 tubes can be seen to rise from the centre of the cylinder. They have varying heights of between 2.5 and 3 metres. The compressors and timer mechanism cause the foam to rise through the vertical perspex tubes. Once at the top of the tubes, the foam slides over the rim and slips down the sides. And I take a quote here from Tate's description of the work, quote, "The bubbles are produced constantly and form cloud-like clusters at the top of the tube," end quote. As the work's title suggests, the piece on display in the Queer British Art Show was one in a suite of works that Medalla made in the 1960s. Although first made in 1961, the number 3 piece was remade in 2004 for the exhibition Art in the 60s, This Was Tomorrow, which was later purchased by Tate Britain. It was acquired by Tate in 2006. On to Medalla and British sculpture. Medalla's nomination in 2016 for Britain's prestigious Hepworth Prize for Sculpture shows that his work has recently, some would say belatedly, been acknowledged as part of Britain's sculptural tradition. Although he has not been situated in relation to a lineage including Henry Moore and Anthony Caro, his work has connections to those who have been placed firmly in that line. Among them, the so-called new generation sculptures, such as Tim Scott, Philip King, David Annesley, William Tucker. Medalla's 1961 version of Cloud Canyons, for instance, was made in the same year as Tim Scott's Peach Wheels from 1961 to 2, and only a couple of years before Philip King's Tra-La-La. One could also highlight parallels between the practices, just as Medalla used materials such as perspex. New generation sculptures were distinguished for their use of such new materials. More specifically, the combination of materials in Cloud Canyons, metal and perspex, also shared some of the material preoccupations with new generation artists, such as Isaac Whitking in works such as his Nagas with his use of fiberglass, but also in the work Alter Ego from 1963, which used wood, metal and fiberglass. Indeed, it was the use of such material that allowed new generation to be placed at some point in contradistinction to the prevailing sculptural practices of the time. Given Medalla's absence from debates about such matters, one could begin to discuss his marginalisation within Britain's modern sculptural traditions. There needs to be an acknowledgement, though, that Medalla's work has been set apart, or at least treated differently to the sculpture of many of his contemporaries working in a similar vein. Stark differences emerge, for instance, in the institutional handling of the work. The sculptures made by the main figures within the New Generation group, for instance, entered the major national collection of contemporary art in Britain at the time, then the Tate Gallery, within a decade of its production. This was largely due to a donation in 1970 by the construction magnate Alistair, later Lord McAlpine, which became known as the McAlpine Gift and became connected to a 1971 show of the New Generation sculptors at Tate. Medalla's work did not feature as part of this set of circumstances and indeed did not enter the Tate collection until 2006, more than 4 decades after its original production. Part of the reason for Medalla's historical marginalisation within sculptural traditions can be related to his range of output, which went beyond the production of sculptural objects. According to the artist's most prolific commentator, Guy Brett, whom I've already cited, Madonna's practice developed sequentially as follows, and please allow me just to outline the phases that Brett uses, which I think are helpful. The first phase, kinetics, from 1963 to 7, emphasised humankind's relationship to nature. The second phase, participation, from 67 to 76, underlined interactions between people, nature, culture, art, and politics. The third phase, performance and painting, from 1975, around 1975, stressed subjectivity and lived reality. Madonna's biokinetics formed part of his early phase, and it represented the marked separation between questions of sculptural form. Such matters had arguably preoccupied the mainstream of British post-war sculpture since the time of Moore and Hepworth, this preoccupation with form. So, for instance, discussions following Moore and Hepworth were preoccupied with questions of open and closed form. According to Guy Brett, though, it was the emphasis on movement within biokinetics that led to Madalla's concern with tender sensuousness. So the emphasis on biokinetics in cloud canyons demonstrated a marked shift away from the mainstream sculptural preoccupations towards the possibilities offered by mechanization, which allowed Medalla to explore new ideas of movement, space, and time. Guy Brett underlines the interrogation of movement within cloud canyons, and in his book Kinetic Art, The Language of Movement, he included a later version of the work, the Cloud Canyons piece, Bubble Machine No. 2, from 1964. The preoccupation with movement in cloud canyons allied the work to debates later taken up in conceptualism. It was Medalla himself who connected his work to what later became some of the tenets of conceptualism when he said, and I quote, "I wouldn't call myself a sculptor because a sculptor is one who shapes things out of what is there. I shape things more out of my head," end quote. So even if one accepts Medalla's ambivalent position in relation to British sculptural traditions due to formal concerns, it remains possible to argue for a stronger position of Medalla's work as one of the precursors to conceptualism in Britain. Art historians have recognised the significance, for instance, of Gustav Metzger's work in this regard. Indeed, the writer Joe Aplin has stated, and I quote here, "The precarious state of the object in the mid-1960s as something that was provisional, vulnerable, and unstable was to become intrinsic to sculptural practice by the end of the decade, with a drive towards conceptualism. Metzger's auto-destructive activities might be considered precursors to that later dematerialization of the object." So Metzger's auto-destructive work, in my view, cannot be easily cloven from Medalla's auto-creative bubble machines. Indeed, tape curator Andrew Wilson has pointed out that the bubble machines were clearly in a critical relation to Metzger's work. This critical relation crystallised in the connection of the artist with his signals, of course, and it was made evident by the publication of Metzger's fifth manifesto, alongside a brief discussion of Medalla's bubble and sand machines in the Signals Bulletin of September 1964. It's the preoccupation with growth, motion, and animation in Medalla's cloud canyons that provides the direct relation to Metzger's interest in destruction. For Metzger underlined that his disinterest in ruins per se, favouring instead an interest in the process of disintegration. And again, as Andrew Wilson has written, I quote, "The process of auto-destructive art does not stop with the object, but has a distinct social and ethical dimension as public art in creating a degree of catharsis," end quote. It is the question of process that links the auto-destructive to the auto-creative. The work of Cloud Canyon should therefore be seen in terms of motion and animation processes. The internal motion of machines having parallels with the internal motion of human bodies. And again, going to Guy Brett, quote, movement produces the possibility of a work whose form is a process of growth, end quote. So it's in such terms that I argue that if Metzger's auto-destruction must be seen as a direct antecedent to British traditions of conceptualism, then Medalla's auto-creativity must too. The problem posed by positioning Cloud Canyons, as it was in the Queer British Art Show, can be thought of in terms of a dislocation. One in which we can see that, in terms of British art historical discourse, the work has literally been treated as something out of place. There is an exceptionality forced on Cloud Canyons. Such exceptionality was replicated in the handling of the work in respect of the show. By placing it outside of the exhibition, it exposes the presuppositions on which the show was based. For the work met the chronological parameters of the show, 1861 to 1967. It also met the formal parameters of the show. Since the exhibition also contains sculpture such as Frederick Leighton's The Sluggard from 1885, bronze work, and Hamo Thornycroft's The Mower from 1888 to 90. The show even included non-figurative abstract geometric work on Marlowe Moss, including the composition in yellow, black and white from 1949, and Moss's abstract geometrical sculpture Balanced Forms in Gunmetal and Cornish Granite from 1956 to 7. So in the case of queer British art, the exceptionality of Cloud Canyons becomes startlingly clear in relation to a particularly exclusive rehearsal of a national tradition. Such a reiteration refuses the nuance of nationhood and belonging that has existed in Britain, at least since the post-1945 period. It's the difficulty of articulating nuances within such a malleable category as Britishness that proves to pose such an intractable problem for British art historians and consequently for curators in Britain's national museums. What belongs to our national tradition is a question that must continually, and I think legitimately, be posed. It remains significant for practical terms of acquisition and exhibition production, as well as for broader issues such as the recounting of national narratives, which I'm sure we will get to discuss. But alongside such issues are another set of questions, reintroducing the issue of the unresolved relationship of Britain to its enduring legacy of its colonial past. Who belongs to our national tradition is the supplementary question, after which a set of truculent refusals seem to follow, a reluctance to recognise British culture as constituted through a history of migrations across the globe. As Salman Rushdie has said, or was reputed to have said, quote, "The British don't know their history because so much of it took place overseas." The problem of who is British and who is not persists. The makeshift solutions emerge that some people are perhaps more British than others, which in turn produces its own issues. Moving to the conclusion. During an interview, Madonna spoke of his birth near Manila Bay in the Philippines and of his constant journeying throughout his life. Referring to his migrations, he said, I don't feel as a migrant, as an exile. I feel at home anywhere, like clouds, end quote. It appears, though, as if Madalla's being at home anywhere cannot translate into somewhere specific, like, take it. Given that the Philippines was not part of the British Empire, a thorny question does arise over where one places a work by an artist born near Manila Bay. To put such work at the centre of an exhibition about British art would surely make a point about the migratory character of British cultural traditions. It is precisely the either-or approach that would make it easy to leave cloud cannons outside of a show titled Queer British Art. The only way to avoid the trap of having to leave the work out of place is to reconsider what we think the place of Britain is and how it got to be there. As cultural producers charged with the rehearsing of national traditions, there is a need to recognise that such traditions are inherently migratory and dynamic. The tracing of a line from Simeon Solomon to David Hockney cannot delineate a history of queer British art if it fails to follow the ups and downs, the ins and outs, what I like to call the rounds and abouts that constitute British history as a whole. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David, for the extraordinarily articulate paper, and I look forward to discussing that extraordinary curatorial decision more later. I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Eva Bentcheva. Eva is an art historian and curator. She completed her PhD in art history at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. Her dissertation, titled On the Cultural Politics of British South Asian Performance 1960s to the Present, examined the relationship between performance art and expressions of diasporic identity in Britain. In 2016, she was awarded a visiting research fellowship by the Tate Research Centre, Asia, to study the participatory performances of Philippines-born artist David Medalla during the 60s and 70s. She is currently an adjunct researcher at the Tate Research Centre, Asia, where she examines the emergence of performance art and conceptualism in the Philippines during the 60s to 80s. She is co-director of, I'll mispronounce it, Batu Balani Art Projects, an independent initiative to promote Philippine art in the UK, and recently contributed to the establishment of an archive of performance art from Southeast Asia at the Live Art Development Agency in London. Eva will give a paper titled Conceptualism, Scepticism and Creative Cross-Pollination in the work of David Medalla, 1969 to 72. Thank you, Eva. The floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak here today. I'm really actually glad to be following on from David, because just as you've unpacked David Medalla's positioning within British art history, I've been thinking over the last few months how we can actually think about unpacking his situatedness within Philippine art history. So the paper that I'm going to give to you today is really it's a thought process that's been going on for me in terms of how we can situate him in the Philippines, whether it makes sense to do that, and what new readings of his art maybe also come out of that as a result of it. So my paper today is fundamentally about certain conceptual transitions, if we can say so, within Medalla's practice. In this sense, I'd like to bring about a discussion of intersectionality as a conversation between two different, albeit also parallel, national art histories, that of the Philippines and that of select countries also in Europe. And more specifically, I'd like to examine how Medalla's contact with the emerging conceptual art scene in the Philippines during the 1960s may have had an impact upon his attitude towards conceptualism more widely. So in this respect, my understanding of the connections between these different national art histories partially builds onto what Thai curator Apinan Posyananda describes in his chapter in the Global Conceptualism's catalogue, where he speaks of conceptualism in Asia as a non-linear phenomenon constantly in flux. I'm not going to give too much of a biography to Medalla because I think David's done a good job with that already. Suffice to say that Medalla left the Philippines for Europe in 1960. And throughout the 1960s, his practice was really marked by two forms of art. The first is his kinetic sculptures, which he produced largely while with the Signals Art Gallery, and the second are a form of participatory performances, which he later developed with Exploding Galaxies. Now, in relation to conceptualism, as David has already pointed out, and I agree here, what both of these forms have in common is this return to motion as a starting point for denoting either greater cultural or scientific principles. So for instance, the sculptural motion that we see in Medalla's bubble machines evokes certain scientific principles, but they also allude to certain historical traumas and to the power of creativity which comes when motion goes into art. The performances such as Buddha Ballet and Bird Ballet, which he scripted and choreographed as part of Exploding Galaxies, they also use motion, in this sense social motion, as a way to evoke youth sentiments, cross-cultural movements, and narratives which employ intermediality. It's this emphasis on the performativity and the motion in the works which I think has made his sculptures be particularly valuable and particularly present also in certain key exhibitions of the time. And I'm thinking here particularly of Harald Zeemann's exhibitions such as Weiss auf Weiss, which presented early minimalist sculpture, in which Medalla's bubble machines were included on the basis that they used performativity to show greater meanings and references through what would otherwise be seen just as static sculpture. In Weiss auf Weiss, the bubble machines are framed as dreamlike, anthropomorphic, living and breathing sculptures which are also evocative of certain migratory movements. It's a similar understanding of art as something ephemeral and as a vehicle for transitory encounters and poetic statements that also underpins Medalla's inclusion in Zeemann's seminal yet also controversial exhibition, Live in Your Head When Attitudes Become Forms, Works, Concepts, Processes, Situations, Information. And I'm reading out the full title here because I think it's those latter keywords that are part of the title that really describe what Medalla was doing as part of that exhibition, for which he was never actually present in person. At the time when the exhibition was put together, he was traveling en route around Asia and Africa. And his contributions were materials which he claims to have posted via mail to Harald Zeemann. They included things like drawings, small items accompanied by instructions, poetry and site-specific performances dedicated also to the theme of the exhibition. So thematically, it's actually these actions which are seen as being connected to the exhibition's overall concept. More importantly, I think here, it's Medalla's philosophy that was seen as being aligned with the main theme of the exhibition, and more specifically, it's the multimedia nature of his work, the fact that it's evocative, that it's gestural, that it's ephemeral, and most importantly, that it's an integral part of the artist's personal and creative outlook. So I'd like to state that for me, this is the first phase of Medalla's conceptualism, if we can call it that. It is, however, also during this voyage of 1969 that Medalla's self-framing in relation to conceptualism also takes a turn, namely through the encounter with the emerging model of conceptual practices, which were then emerging in the Philippines, where he arrived back in the summer of 1969. Now, already before leaving the Philippines for Europe in 1960, Medalla's career as an experimental artist in the Philippines had already started to take shape. He had cultivated a circle of friends interested in the arts, and literature, and had organized regular gatherings in his home in the Mabini district in Manila. He was also an active contributor to the contemporary art galleries, for instance, the Philippine Arts Gallery and the Arts Lab, and he developed his practice foremost as a poet and a painter, working largely in the style of art brut. And here I've given you an example of an early self-portrait by him. Furthermore to this, he also began to play with the notion of performativity, and as Filipino art historian Eileen Legaspi Ramirez points out, he also at this stage started to lay claim to being one of the first performance or participatory artists in the Philippines, a self-proclaimed status which also has been contested by some. So during almost a decade of his absence, Medalla, however, did not sever his ties with the Philippine art scene, and that's between 1960 to 69 that I'm referring here. His interactions with key curators and gallerists had guaranteed him a place in exhibitions on contemporary Philippine art. And despite leaving, he continued to be recognized throughout the 1960s as being a key figure in Philippine experimental art. And I'm emphasizing here the notion of experimental art because it's going to crop up several times along the way. Group exhibitions, such as the one which I'm featuring here at the Lutz Gallery, included a number of artists working in the field of so-called experimental art, and this included both abstract and neo-realist painters who had been very active in the 1950s and dominated the art scene, but also a more contemporary generation now coming up in the 1960s who were working largely in minimalist sculpture and also experimental collages and painting. For me, Medalla's placement in this selection situated him within a history of Philippines-based artists increasingly turning towards multimedia work, performance and conceptualism. Among these artists was Roberto Chabet, an artist who would, over the coming 2 decades, carve out a place for himself as a leading figure in Philippine conceptual art. And already in the early 1970s, Chabet engaged with Medalla's role in Philippine art history. And I'd like to quote an interview where Chabet actually commented on the significance of Medalla for Philippine art history. And this interview was given in July 1973 in conversation with the Philippine art writer Sid Reyes, where Reyes asks Chabet, "We hear much of what is called avant-garde art. Do you think the Philippines can claim to have such an art?" To which Chabet responds, "Well, not avant-garde in the sense of ahead of its times. What is considered avant-garde in the Philippines may not be considered avant-garde in another country. Let's just call it experimental art." Sid Reyes then probes further and asks, "Filipino artists are conscious about being up-to-date, especially now in an age of instant communication where worldwide information is disseminated effortlessly. Just how up-to-date are our artists?" To which Chabet replies, "I don't know. I think our couturiers are more advanced in their ideas than our artists. Medalla, I think, is the only Filipino artist who never stops experimenting. He is very, very avant-garde, although it is possible that some of his works are quite dated." And for me, I'd like to highlight here that I read Chabet as doing something in differentiating between the avant-garde and the experimental. I think that this is a strategy for presenting his own work in a way also as different to that of Medalla. For Chabet never lay claim on the status of being avant-garde, but he did lay claim to being experimental within the Philippine art scene. So here I think we can see an example sort of an internal maybe tension between two artists who would have naturally maybe also been grouped in a similar way. For there were several notable similarities in their works. By the mid-1960s, Chabet was also already experimenting with abstract painting and making constructions using ready-made materials, such as plywood, which he referred to as experiential environments. After also visiting the United States on a grant in the late 1960s, Chabet, like Medalla, too became well-versed in the language of Euro-American modernism and experimental practices. Throughout the 1960s and the 1970s, he worked alongside a number of artists in collective projects, such as the short-lived artists' venture Shop 6 from 1974 to 1975, and the collaborative projects done with the so-called Liwayway Recapping Company, which is a pseudonym for Chabet working with 2 other artists, one Boy Perez and the other the artist-curator Raimundo Albano, who's going to come up at a later stage in my talk as well. This group was interested also in expanding the parameters of the visual arts, using ready-made materials and staging ephemeral installations and immersive environments. They communicated their meaning through symbolism and experiential modes, and often employed also language and writing to express their ideas. At first glance, there's a certain formal parallel with some of Medalla's experiments, maybe with what he was doing in kinetic sculpture, this attempt to try and break free of the mold of Euro-American minimalism. There's also another similarity with how Medalla worked with other artists in collectives, sort of bringing them together, doing temporary projects before those collectives disintegrate and break up. But most importantly, there's a certain parallel that both claimed a certain anti-institutional status. It is this last point which is particularly important when we consider Medalla's art in the framework of the Philippine conceptualism, and which, I would also argue, led to his self-imposed distancing from Philippine conceptualism, and a revision of his own outlook also on art's social and political obligations. This breach may be understood in light of a growingly intertwined relationship between, on the one hand, contemporary art practices in the Philippines, and on the other hand, the growing cultural politics of the dictatorial Marcos regime, which was taking place in the late 1960s. By the late 1960s, the Marcuses had begun to expand their sphere of influence through the co-option of the arts. The building of massive new structures to showcase and champion the arts, most notably the Cultural Center of the Philippines, which is often referred to as the CCP for short, set out to become a venue, really, for showcasing the arts in general. So it brought together theatre, music, dance, and the visual arts in a kind of in a bit of a grand scheme unison of all of the art forms. And also, under the first directorship, which was under the aforementioned artist Roberto Chabet, as the first director of the CCP, it also set out to showcase and provide patronage for contemporary art with a particular affinity for abstract, minimalist, and conceptualism-inspired art. Commenting in 1973, the second director of the CCP, Raimundo Albano, speaking now as the acting substitute curator after Chabet resigned in 1971, Albano spoke specifically about the CCP's emphasis on taking up and housing conceptualism, and he described it sort of in the following words. He's saying, quote here, "The thing is, we have a mistaken notion that just because conceptual art originated in New York, in Paris, or in Germany, it should not be adapted here. The reason why the CCP appears to promote this movement is because it's the only gallery in town which can provide an outlet for this kind of art. It is art representing ideas which cannot be sold, and therefore the other galleries are just not open to it." So he's presenting it as a practical situation in which there's no market for it outside the CCP, therefore they are taking it on board. The reality is, however, that it was part of a larger project of nation building, in which the backing of these genres was seen to present the Philippines as modern and progressive, as well as to reaffirm its alliance with American cultural and political ties. Now, for Medalla, who had arrived back to the Philippines in 1969, he would have been a direct witness to these developments in the Philippine art scene. As he was also an active contributor to the Philippines art scene, this co-option posed several notable problems. First of all, while Medalla had never been shy of making high-ranking connections, the merging of political and institutional powers with the sphere of cultural freedom was very problematic for him. Secondly, while Medalla was never against cross-cultural borrowing, in fact, he often advocated that the Philippines should more openly embrace its Spanish and American cultural roots in order to use this for new creative purposes. He saw the art which was being championed by select political and economic elites as being deeply derivative, and I quote him here, he said, "It is a whole lifestyle that is utterly borrowed, imitative, and trivial." So in light of these factors, his impromptu protest at the inauguration night of the Cultural Center of the Philippines, in which he prepared a poster to be hung from the first floor balcony as the Marcuses entered, may be read as more than an expression of embitterment for being excluded from what he was seeing as a moment of canonization in Philippine art history. I see it rather as a form of direct critique of the evolution of conceptual practices in the Philippines and the co-option of these media into a certain rhetoric of development, which was being espoused here by the Marcos regime. Now, while this image has been widely circulated and discussed as a moment of political intervention by Medalla into Philippine politics, what's of interest for me to consider here is that it's also a certain moment of intersection. On the one hand, it's an intersection of Medalla's conceptualism before visiting the Philippines now. On the other hand, it's also an intersection with the emerging discourses around Philippine conceptualism. And lastly, it's also an intersection with a certain politicization of conceptualism which comes about afterwards. I'd argue that the aftermath of this event and the fact that Medalla was forced to actually flee the country following this protest, not to return again until the late 1980s, in doing so, he also made a conscious choice to distance himself from the emerging practices of Philippine conceptualism, and particularly from the strong institutional ties which it had with the Cultural Center of the Philippines. And for him, this had quite acute implications in terms of how he has been written into Philippine art history during this time, having been excluded from certain key awards and exhibitions that took place in the Cultural Center during the 1970s. And one of the most influential ones of these is the so-called 13 Artists Award, which is something that continues until this day. It's an award given mainly to young artists working with experimental media. And I'm giving you a snapshot here of the awardees for the very first one that was given out in 1970. And 6 out of the 13 artists that received that award were also earlier featured in that Lutz Gallery exhibition, which I showed you earlier, of 20 seminal Filipino artists. Medalla's name is not among these, but that of Marciano or Mars Galang is, and you will recognize Mars Galang here as the person to the left of Medalla, looking at it this way. As part of this protest. So this is just an example of how the CCP aimed to put itself at the helm of experimental art practices in the 1970s. And this is a snapshot of the type of work that was being shown, ranging from abstract painting and sculpture to more conceptualism-inspired works such as experimental photography, installations, and immersive environments. It even laid claim to some of the earliest performance artworks or happenings in the Philippines. But what's most significant for me is that it was also seminal in the discourse building of the time. So by the end of the 1960s, Raimundo Albano actually posited his own definition of conceptual and performance art practices in the Philippines, calling them developmental art. In a further effort to justify the existence of these media within the remit of the Cultural Center of the Philippines, the notion of developmental here was meant to be an overt reference to what the Marcos regime was actually terming developmental projects to lift the Philippines out of its third world status. As art historian Patrick Flores also claims, the notion of development here, however, also has a formal function. It refers to fast and ephemeral projects that can change form and context, and also in a certain way combat the Philippines' colonial and modernist past. So in this sense, developmental here toes the line between what's politically acceptable and what was also formally permissible. So in light of these, I think Medalla's protest, in light of these developments in the sphere of conceptual art throughout the 1970s, Medalla's protest at the inauguration of the Cultural Center may be read as tapping into another lineage of Philippine art, and that one actually is not conceptual. It's very much painterly. I'd like to state from the outset that Medalla never identified himself as working with this group of artists, but that there is a strong parallel between his work. And this is a group of painters who came to be active in the Philippines during the 1970s, known as social realists, who used painting, and particularly very figurative painting that also alluded to surrealism, in order to explicitly critique the Marcos government. They were, in a sense, an explicit rejection of conceptual art. While Medalla never formally identified with this group, there are strong formal commonalities. A certain belief that the nation-state is a force of repression, a sympathy for socialist convictions, and a belief that the artist has the power to highlight social injustices. I believe that these principles come to light in a number of the works which he produced upon his return to Europe, which were no longer devoted to being purely poetic and cross-cultural, but now also served as strategies to engage collective labor and certain creative discourses, seen here most prominently through A Stitch in Time, which I always read as an effort to bring people together into a certain platform of discussion and also as a form of institutional critique. It's also seen in his later projects. This is the protest performance that him and John Duggar did, accompanying A Stitch in Time and the structure that they built together at Documenta 5. So this again for me highlights a certain sort of socialist underpinning and political critique coming through in A Stitch in Time. Throughout the 1970s, he also organized events, protests, gatherings, and discussions, which explicitly also critiqued political developments within the Philippines. And so I'd like to end on a certain note in which actually we consider Medalla's art here, not only as an explicit rejection of conceptualism in the Philippines, but also as a cross-pollination of multiple trajectories. And I find art historian Patrick Flores' notion of a missing link here very useful in describing Medalla's practice. A missing link not only in bringing together conceptual practices, but also putting them into discussion again with painterly practices and certain socio-political critiques developing both in Asia and in Europe during that time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ava, for that incredibly richly researched paper and very interesting parallels and cross-pollinations with David's. It's a pleasure to introduce the third speaker of the session, Professor Sonia Boyce. Sonia is an artist and academic who, since the 1990s, who's been influenced by the relational practice of artist Lygia Clark. Early in her career, she was regarded as one of the key figures in the burgeoning Black British arts movement of the 1980s. Boyce has developed a social art practice, including a Nesta Fellowship in 2005 and an AHRC Research Fellowship in 2008 to 11, which culminated in a group residential laboratory, The Future is Social. She has taught studio practice in art schools across the UK for over 30 years, and as an artist has represented the UK at the Venice Biennial in 2015. She exhibits extensively internationally, has worked in major collections, has work in major collections including the Tate, V&A and Arts Council England. Boyce is currently Professor of Black Art and Design at University of the Arts London and the Principal Investigator for the AHRC-funded Black Artists and Modernism. Sonia will present her paper, Dearly Beloved, Transitory Relations and the Queering of Women's Work in David Medalla's A Stitch in Time, 1967 to 72. Thank you very much, Sonia.
I have to say that I quite like standing by a lectern and being hidden a bit by, that's because I'm never sure why I agree to do these things, because they're terrifying to present papers. But thank you all the same for accepting my proposal in the call out. Okay, I shall just begin. The inspiration for A Stitch in Time reveals the atomic nature of my artworks. In 1967, two lovers of mine came to London. One was on his way from California to India. The other was on his way from Africa to New York. I arranged to meet them at Heathrow Airport and gave each one a handkerchief, one black, one white, some needles, small spools of cotton and thread. I told them they could stitch anything they liked on the handkerchiefs, on which I had stitched my name and a brief message of love. I said that stitching could alleviate boredom if delays might occur while waiting for their flights. I lost track of my lovers. One day, many years later, while waiting for my flight back to England at Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam, I noticed a handsome young man who was carrying a backpack to which a column of cloth was attached, like a long pillow. There were also, I spoke to him and he showed me the cloth with many little objects attached onto it, like old Chinese coins or fragments from a broken bamboo whistle, torn cigarette packets, even cigarette butts, and all kinds of embroidered messages. The young man said someone in Bali had given him the column and told him he could stitch anything on it. I looked at the bottom of the cloth and saw the black handkerchief I had gave to one of my lovers with my name and message on it. I handed it back to the young man, but did not tell him that it had started as my stitch in time. This introduction to A Stitch in Time by David Medalla comes out of an interview with his collaborator and partner Adam Nankervis, and for me acts like a genesis story of homosocial and transnational encounters, multiple and transitory lovers, and fleeting conversations with a handsome young man. Here I think there's a kind of release from the constraints of a nationalist or a heteronormative and a patriarchal perspectives, and I think this is fundamental to the offer of the artwork. From London to California and India, Africa to New York, Heathrow in London to Schiphol in Amsterdam, Chinese artifacts and brief encounters in Bali, all predicated on the totemic and transitory exchange of everyday objects. Its beginning speaks of how spatial, sexual and social relationships were being refashioned in the 1960s. And for me, there are echoes of Marc Augé's Non-Places introduction to an anthropology of supermodernity, the book that he wrote in 1995, with his focus on the impact of technology on space, travel and place. An example would be airports that have a transformative effect on the congregation and flow of people. A Stitch in Time can be seen as a kind of counter-narrative to accelerated time and place, asking instead to stop, to sit, give and make. As a sculptural event, A Stitch in Time invites audiences to sew small objects of personal significance onto a long stretch of suspended cloth in a public place. The invitation builds evidence of a collective mark that challenges the dominant ideas about art's production. Medalla called these artworks participation, production, propulsions, thus converting individual acts of contemplative creative energy into a glorious collective force. Versions of A Stitch in Time have been shown in many different places, such as Documented 5, as we've already seen from Ava's paper, curated by Harold Schneemann in Kassel, Germany, and the Gallery House in London in the exhibition A Survey of the Avant-Garde in Britain, curated by Siggy Kraus and Rosetta Brooks. Both of these exhibitions took place in 1972. More recently, the work was shortlisted again, as David has kind of mentioned, for the 2017 Hepworth Prize for Sculpture in Wakefield, and again exhibited in this year's 57th Venice Biennale. The artwork is an invitation and a question. Writer Guy Brett puts it rather succinctly, and I quote, "It was easy to enter." And here he quotes David Medalla, "People can walk in and out of my situations." And the invitation to sew took away all preconceptions associated with high art, yet the ambience exerted subtle psychological pressures, end quote. The psychological pressures inferred is a proposition to the viewer to give something of themselves, to cross the threshold between subject and artwork, often beyond the reach of an audience's touch, or otherwise to keep one's distance and remain a viewer. For Brett, the challenge is to hurry by or to offer your time. What is being presented is a site, or to be more precise, a sculpture event, through and around which friends and strangers can congregate around the act of sewing, as Medalla has noted, and I quote, "The thing I like best about this work is that whenever anyone is involved in the act of stitching, he or she is inside his or her own private space, even though the act of stitching might occur in a public place." End quote. I want to look rather briefly at this term of a sculptural event. If the definition of sculpture is understood as the forming of an active process of carving, modelling, worlding, or placing something in three-dimensional space that represents a thing, a person, or an idea, this work constitutes less than modelling, more a build-up of other people's stuff, what some might call trash or detritus. Sculpture invariably asks us to walk around it, to keep a viewing and contemplative distance. Beauty here, if that's a concern at all, resides in the accumulative effect, the performing of a sculptural circumstance that becomes conditional and contingent on us being there, embedded in its context. We are all familiar with the narrative of sweeping changes around the world that took place during the 1960s, which was dominated by the Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement, and of course the Stonewall protests, national liberation struggles opposing colonial rule, and of course the advocacy of women's rights through the growing feminist movement. There was also a defining break being made from the dominant attitudes towards art. And of course shifts occurred amongst the new sculpture generation that David Medalla spoke of after the post-war period, beyond the kind of dominating, one could say, scene of artists like Henry Moore and Barbara Hepworth, who art historian Andrew Causey suggests suggests wanted to maintain a tightly guarded boundary between art and life. John A. Walker, in his book Art Since Pop, gives an account of the material and conceptual new ground that was being forged by artists in Britain, and he states, "Sculptors have traditionally favoured hard, durable materials in order to create rigid objects that remain constant in form. However, no sooner had minimal art established itself publicly than a different attitude to form and a more Catholic approach to materials was manifested." End quote. A formlessness emerged that searched for a non-rigid and less formulaic set of conditions away from the autonomy of art to its context, from art's formless essence to its effect. This move towards greater social awareness was sweeping away the old guard as articulated in Lucy Lippard's 6 Years of Dematerialisation of the Art Object from 1966 to 1972. And of course, I know that Lucy Lippard has been kind of mentioned a few times. Lippard remarks that a radical emergent group of conceptual artists were keen to escape the frame and pedestal syndrome in which art had found itself. And it's actually quite interesting seeing Eva's presentation when she talks about the Philippine artists who are talking about kind of experimentation, but they're still kind of bound by this idea of the pedestal and the frame, I think. So it's often forgotten, of course not today, but in general it's often forgotten or downplayed that Medalla was at the forefront of these emerging trends, given his role in avant-garde practices in London at the time with projects like Signals Gallery and Artists for Democracy. He was one of the artists invited to take part in the landmark exhibition Live in Your Head. I never know whether they say live in your head or live in your head, because it kind of does both for me, but anyway. When Attitudes Become Formed, curated by Harold Schneeman in Bern in 1969, that focus on the behaviours and gestures of an emerging generation of artists. Again, Medalla's entry in the exhibition catalogue, a handwritten letter to Schneeman, denotes his trademark journey. So from Venice to Bombay, Mombasa in Kenya, the Philippines Embassy in New Delhi, Dakar in Senegal, Kerala in South India, Ceylon, and his collaboration with other artists and writers, John Duggar from the USA and Guy Brett in London. And I suppose part of what I'm kind of thinking here is that, you know, when one talks about artists being from a particular place, you know, he's such a character of someone who's moved globally as an artist and involved other kind of artists in that kind of global discussion that I think it's really worth noting here. So let us not forget the impact also of feminist art practices and critiques, which was a key ingredient of the sweeping changes seen in the 1960s. And I've been thinking actually about a work by Yoko Ono called Cut Piece, first performed in Kyoto in 1964 and then in New York and London. For me, whilst it points to a more aggressive, even potentially more violent message than A Stitch in Time, in Cut Piece, the artist, who I'm sure many people know this piece, sat alone on the stage, dressed in her best suit, with a pair of scissors in front of her. The audience were told that they could take turns approaching her and use the scissors to cut off a small piece of her clothing, which was theirs to keep. So cutting and sewing, the private and the public, as well as the boundaries between the individual and the collective, are what partially connects these two artworks. Remarkably, in the critical reception of A Stitch in Time, little has been said about the employment of needlecraft as its basis, a practice that was once considered women's work, which begs the question, to what extent is A Stitch in Time in dialogue with feminist and other conceptual critiques of the hierarchical values within art? Rosika Parker, in her highly influential book, The Subversive Stitch, Embroidery in the Making of the Feminine, chronicles the devalued histories of women's needlecraft by amending as well as through acts of destruction and resistance. In the book, she makes connections with the coded prescriptions of repression and displaced female sexuality, a kind of popular imaginary that situates the lone figure of a mainly white middle-class female, a kind of feminine ideal, waiting at home quietly engrossed in her domestic activities of cultured embroidery. Parker notes the historical divisions between the arts, having fine arts on one side pitched against craft as a major factor in the marginalisation of women's creative outputs. Karen Rosenberg, in reviewing a recent exhibition where needlecraft has entered the sphere of contemporary art practice, writes about an exhibition called Pricked Extreme Embroidery, which was held in New York in 2007, and she says, in the 1970s, artists who swapped their paintbrushes for a needle and thread were making a feminist statement. Today, as both men and women fill galleries with crochet culture and sculpture and stitched canvases, the gesture isn't automatically quite so specific, end quote. It's only in recent years that widespread audiences for contemporary art become familiar with the invitation to get involved actively in artworks by entering installations, touching objects, and performing the work itself. And I think, in a way, we can kind of forget actually what that might have meant in the 60s, when we are now so familiar with the activity of everybody being able to kind of get involved in the making of the work in a much more widespread way. In the early 60s, Medalla was introduced to the work of Lygia Clark, who was also concerned with the liberating possibilities of group encounters as art practice. By 1965, Medalla and his collaborator Paul Keeler invited Clark to exhibit at Signals Gallery, thus introducing her work to a London audience. In her essay, Play, Ritual and Politics, Transitional Artworks in the 1960s, Anna de Zeus writes, and I quote, in their shared interest in human engagement with the world of things, Lygia Clark, Helio Tisica, Yoko Ono and Bertolt Brecht created works that set up a new space of in-betweenness, between subject and object, mind and matter, inside and outside. This in-betweenness, I would argue, can be usefully compared to the intermediate area of experience that was delineated by British psychoanalyst Donald W. Winnicott in his notion of the transitional object. Winnicott explained how a favourite toy, blanket or other object can play an important role in the process through which infants and small children gradually learn to differentiate themselves from their mother's body and to perceive themselves as separate human beings. The transitional object exists in an intermediate space because it is perceived by the child simultaneously as two contradictory experiences. On the one hand, the transitional object appears to be totally controlled by the child, as in the infant's experience of being able to possess and become at one with the mother's breast when it cries out to be fed. Yet on the other hand, it exists in itself, separate from the child who chose it, just like the mother who is gradually perceived as a different and sometimes absent person. Now, the reason why I bring this into the conversation is that there was a lot of discussion, particularly with artists like Lygia Clark and David Medalla at that time, about the importance of the dynamics that happen when you bring groups of people together. What de Zeus argues is how these artists shift the focus from works of art as commodities, recognising that objects and subject-object relations has the potential for social transformation, underscoring the dependency between self and other. Now, in my title of my paper, I talk about transitory relations, which I'm still trying to kind of figure out. But by that, I mean temporary exchanges between people and objects. And in the Stitch in Time, this has a different register, for me, it has a different register to the transitional object relations discussion. While still bearing an emotional connection or a personal situation, transitory relations are shifted from what I consider to be the recriminations projected onto the mother's body of being either a good enough mother or a bad mother, a figure who has neglected the child and is thus absent. There is a different kind of abandonment for me, or a different kind of abandonment issue from that mother-child scenario, where an ambivalence prevails that is both festive and throwaway within a Stitch in Time. In its hopeful sense, I think it's very polyvocal in terms of its accumulation of various voices, but it's also melancholic. And I go back to the original story of Medalla's message of love and intimacy. There must be an element of sadness that an item that was quite personal and maybe treasured has been traded, and that the future life of that object, and also those interpersonal connections, their status, is now uncertain. By departing from the relational debates that are anchored on the mother's body, A Stitch in Time opens up other possibilities. It revels in the coexistence of different cultural signs and different cultural meanings. And its origin story, and I really love actually the way that he kind of frames the work with this particular narrative, validates a kind of homosocial and transnational space, and offers a gender-contested context by stitching. So here I think he's kind of eschewing stitching as a kind of gender-specific activity. Instead, the work becomes an opening for potentially subversive encounters. Thank you.
So thank you very much, all three of you, for those papers. And I suppose, to state the obvious, the first two of those papers, David and Ava's, very much dealt with the question of sort of art historical placement of David's work, whereas Sonia's was obviously offering this close reading and looking at the different kind of influences and inputs that might have produced that work, and the types of effects, as you mentioned, that the work produced. But I want to go back to this extraordinary image of Medalla's work outside the exit to the piece. And I just wonder, David, and perhaps this is the wrong way to put it, but what would happen if that work was inside the show? What discussions would we be having if that work was inside the show, in terms of situating Medalla as queer and British? We're talking about the problems of exclusions from certain histories, but I just wondered what would happen if he was included in that particular history. Would we be having a discussion about reading Medalla just in terms of queerness and Britishness, and how would that complicate things?
Thanks. That's a really useful question. I think that there'll be two things. First of all, the work presents a quite powerful challenge to the basis of the show. I wasn't able to go through the entirety of the show because it would have made a slightly different paper, but the show was pretty much premised on an idea of a kind of what I call a representational economy with it in relation to the queer body. So a lot of figurative work, principally figurative work, although there were some abstract pieces, not all male actually, so there was men and women, but principally figurative work, and quite dominated by painting, but latterly photography as well. And I think that by placing the work inside that kind of context, it would really have thrown up that figurative and representational emphasis or bias in relation to queerness. And it would have problematized a way of thinking about queerness outside of the body as such, and forcing us to think about queerness in very different terms. First of all, in relation to relationality, not individual bodies, because there are a lot of portraits of individual bodies, but much more about relationships between people. And also would have made a slight slippage, and I think this might have been one of the things that the curators were conscious of, is the slippage between, in a sense, the homosexuality and the queer. And the queer being a door to throw open all kinds of issues about non-normative practices. And I suspect that because there was so much an emphasis on wanting to relate this to decriminalisation and to a particular kind of British history in relation to oppressive and subversive practices, which goes back to the keynote actually, about the relationship between oppression and subversion. And so the narrative of subversion being in relation to that oppression, and not wanting then to open a slightly different debate, which I think the creators perhaps saw as not pertinent to that particular relationship. So something else would have happened, I think, for the show as a whole.
And was the work, given the kind of representational paradigm of the piece. I mean, when I read it and you're showing those other images up, I mean, of course, we can also see the work is incredibly phallic. It's spouting white liquid at the end of the show. So did it offer another type of reading to the work that was perhaps not intended?
I think it would have done so again had it somehow been in the show. I think something that would have happened actually. I think you're not the first to kind of point out that I think someone talks about it as a continuous ejaculation, and I think in relation to, which isn't just homosexual of course, but anyway, but it would have been read in those terms. But I think by situating it outside of the show and creating this uncertainty as to whether it was in the show or not, I think missed a trick actually. It missed that slippage or that reading, or even placing other works outside the show in relation to the piece. So to have kind of a continuity, more of a continuity between the inside and the outside of the show, might have been able to do that. But by having this very clear cleavage, if you like, or distinction between the inside and the outside, I think that was foreclosed upon.
And maybe we save it for 1 second. Well, definitely you'll be first. But Ava, I wanted actually to go back to the keynote yesterday. Were you here? Yes. Well done. And thinking about this mapping that we had of the different countries invited by the different curators composed. And I wondered what would we do with the, I won't call it problem, but the situation of Medalla. Where would we put him in that practice, given the fact that he had this difficult relationship with the Philippine art establishment, given his exclusion to a certain extent? Would he want to be situated in that map somewhere?
I think one thing that's important to note now is that in the last 10 years or so, David has been very much rewritten into Philippine art history and reappropriated into it. And he himself was also never somebody that denied his links to the Philippines. I think in that same interview that I quoted, he also says one doesn't always need to illustrate subjects that are about the Philippines in order to be considered an artist from the Philippines. So he never really denied that status for himself. I think in an ideal case scenario, he actually wants to be seen as an artist who is a part of multiple national art histories, as well as sort of the in-between spaces that connect them. And I'll give you one example. For instance, the last work that I showed of Down with the Slave Trade, that is actually a performance that makes explicit reference to the work of Piet Mondrian and so the painterly practices, that sort of grid-like structure in which David got people during the performance to actually sit in sort of a grid-like formation on the ground. So there he's also trying to write or cite himself into an art history of a country that he had not actually visited as well. And I think that that's also quite a peculiar aspect of his practice in a way.
And Sonia, if you'll let me just kind of bring in the museological a little bit into your paper, because you were talking about, or lamenting the fact that these works were now traded, bought and sold, and kind of lost some of their participatory or social currency in a way when they become institutionalized. Should a work like Stitch in Time be in an institution? Should there be a certain moment where there's a resistance to the national collections, the survey shows where this work just needs to live outside those conditions?
No. Yeah, I mean, for me, it was quite wondrous seeing how the work was being really actively built on during the Venice Biennale, in that it's a kind of living organism. But when I say traded, I suppose I'm talking about the original story itself of, one does something incredibly intimate for someone, and then they trade it. And that, in a way, it made me think about all of the objects that are here and what were these objects intended for, and they end up here, and it kind of makes the object and the relations between the people that have given objects a kind of a space of uncertainty. And it's not that institutions should or shouldn't enter into that debate, but that actually it makes the work itself a kind of surrounded by a kind of nervousness or a melancholy that I think is really interesting. So it's not really about whether the work should enter an institution or not, but more that it kind of quivers in a similar way to what was being said about Stanley Brown. There's something about the work that quivers that you kind of don't quite know whether it's joyous or whether it's melancholic, that it kind of vacillates between the two.
I think we're going to go straight to some questions. Someone will need to do my job.
Do you want me to do it?
I think.
I was just, and even this would be a nice metaphor, was just very pragmatically thinking this exclusion of the sculpture of Madonna, if this was coming as a restriction from the Department of Preservation, you know? Yeah. Like saying this produces humidity, and there's something about live art which is really dangerous for the museum. And when we were planning The Beast and the Sovereign, we were in the beginning thinking to show that chocolate fountain from Helen Chadwick. And it would have been the same problem. They would have said you cannot show it in the exhibition because of food. I mean, otherwise, we got another problem with that exhibition, but it started actually with this. So, and in the 90s, it was not a problem to show Helen Chadwick within the collection. But now probably the apparatus of preservation get that. And then but it still would keep a notion of being dangerous.
I think that's a good point. There's a couple of responses. First of all, the work was shown in a show called Migrations, with other works in the vicinity. So how and what, I mean, I don't know about the conservation reports on every single work that was in the vicinity of the work in Migrations, vis-a-vis the conservation reports on every single work that was in the vicinity or proposed vicinity in queer British art, but it does raise certain questions in that regard. And then the other response, because that was part of a discussion that I had with the curators Claire Barlow, by the way, at Tate Britain, who's a great curator, was the problem of, well, if you know that's going to be a problem, then surely you rethink the way in which you're organising the show. And by taking that on board as a problem, then one has to think, well, what then is the other problem that is produced by putting the work where you've placed it? Okay, it's not a conservation problem, but it's a huge critical and epistemological problem. So I'm not sure which is worse, to be honest. So I see the point you're making, but I think there are other issues to take into account.
There are ways around it, right? You build its own room. If you want the work in the show, you can get the work in the show.
Can I just add on to that, because I find that Balloon Machine is a very interesting case, because David actually never makes explicit that this is a work of erotic art. It's something that we always read into it, but the story that he always gives to it is one of trauma, that it's referencing a shooting which he saw in his garden as well. So maybe that is something else also to bear in mind, that the artist has himself framed the work in a very maybe different way that then could have been read in an even more different way if included inside.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's where I think this question about the process, which you spoke about in your paper, is really important, because that reference to the trauma and the shooting is this image of, well, one of them was this image of the bubble coming out of the dead soldier's mouth, which to me makes me think of things about tubes and the processes of the body, somatic process, which is part of death, but also part of sex and different parts of life. So it would have then, again, thrown the show in a very different way, cast the show in a very different way, which would be a fantastic opportunity to be thinking about bodily surfaces, thinking about orifices, and I think a lot of actual queer politics has been about not thinking about, sexuality in such a polarised way, but to try and think about the body as a set of surfaces, as a set of orifices, as a set of connections to be made, material to be made. A lot of work was done by people like Simon Watney in the 80s and 90s, so again, I think an opportunity is missed there.
I stole the microphone.
Okay, so Laura, then we've got
my question is mostly for Sonia, but I'm actually really interested to hear this from all the panelists. I was thinking about I guess the first thing to say is that I noticed all of the pictures that were shown of Medalla with other people were usually men throughout his practice, and I know that Signals was a very male-dominated scene, except for the exception of Lygia Clark. And also, I suppose, in the context of queer British art, which was also a very male-dominated show. Yeah, come on. I would say, anyway, let's not go into that. But there is definitely a higher percentage of male artists than female artists in queer British art. Yeah, I was thinking about Sonia's presentation of Medalla's work as a homosocial work, by that meaning male homosocial, in the fact that it's the homosocial relationship was between men. So I was thinking about that, and then also, but you're looking at the work through the lens of women's work and a feminist reading, but also a queering of feminist work. So the question, which I'm getting to, is I'm kind of thinking about, there's lots of debates when Mike Kelly was using needlework in the 80s about how that was kind of co-opting feminist strategies. So I wondered how you thought about feminism in relation to Medalla and the people he worked with and these strategies. A lot of questions.
In an earlier version, I'm not sure if you were there, when I did the earlier version, where I did talk about Mike Kelly and the way in which a number of feminists were critiquing how he had taken up practices and critiques that they had been engaged in for a really long time and then got overlooked in relation to, that he became almost like the kind of flag bearer of that kind of practice. So I do think it's really kind of complicated about when the balances of power between the genders and these questions. However, I was kind of thinking about, okay, so this work was made in the mid-60s, late 60s. And I kind of think of it as maybe being a gesture towards a sense of, God, I'm going to lose words, that's why I have to write things down, because I lose words really very quickly. But the way in which one might build an alliance with. So I'm trying to think that it's not necessarily this above this, or that in opposition to that, or as binaries, but that there are alliances that might have been shaped, that might have been influenced by each other, and I can really see the connections between what someone like Lydia Clark or Yoko Ono, or a number of, I'm thinking of Susan Hiller's work where she pulls the thread from canvases, and that whole examining of the values that have been almost embedded in art practice that were being critiqued at that time. That I get the sense that David was very much part of that, trying to undo almost that hierarchy in some way. So I do think that the question about him stitching and using stitching and sewing as a practice in inviting others into that space was actually a question not only of a critique but of an alignment as well. So I suppose that's how I'm reading it. But that's not to suggest that that somehow he usurps the space of feminist critique by doing that. I don't think that's not how I'm reading
it. We've got two questions at the front. Sarah?
Yeah, I want to quote Yeats, how can we know the dancer from the dance? Because it's quite unbelievable that nobody has talked about David Medalla's body and his androgynous beauty and the way that flouted all sorts of norms. We saw the unbelievably poignant image of him in between those two great big burly policemen, but it seemed as though David Medalla himself was a kind of elephant in the room, or, a guardian angel who's up there but saying me, 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 because we've just managed to avoid him, which I find quite extraordinary. He was extremely loving and charismatic and disconcerting, and presumably bisexual in certain ways, not necessarily in terms, I don't know anything about his actual practice, but his loving relationships at a time when Marcuse was on everybody's lips with his book Eros and Civilization, promoting polymorphous perversity. So I just want to bring David Medalla's body into the conversation as a performer. You can't separate Boyce from Boyce or Marina Abramovich from Marina Abramovich and say, long live polymorphous perversity.
Thank you, Sarah.
So Thank you for that. That was wonderful. But going back to A Stitch in Time, I know its first iteration was in the 60s, which was around the time of Marcos's presidency. And what struck me was something you said, Eva, about how A Stitch in Time was very kind of democratic, with a lot of engagement from people and kind of bringing people together, and it kind of preempts the people power revolution that happened in the 80s. And so taking A Stitch in Time and placing it in 2017 in the 57th Biennale is interesting because of the Duterte presidency now and the extrajudiciary killings. And so I wondered if you could speak about how reframing this artwork in 2017 and 2016 has changed its meaning.
Are you referring to the Venice Biennale there? Yes. He was not part of the Philippine Pavilion.
Oh no, but
yeah.
This is a show.
No, so he was part of the 2015 Philippine Pavilion, which was then curated by Patrick Flores, and he did some performances around it which were precisely actually on this theme of connecting the world through creative gestures. But his inclusion this year in the 2017 Biennale, that was done under the rubric of Viva Arte Viva, which is art for the sake of art. I don't think David himself nowadays would still necessarily connect that work to a directly political critique. I think the work has in a way taken on an afterlife of its own. The way that it started out in the early 1970s, in those early iterations, I think there it had a certain political charge to it because it was staged, like in Documenta 5, alongside other actions which were very political. But that's something that David did away with in time. So more of its recent iterations has been usually either in gallery spaces, sometimes private galleries, sometimes also bigger museums, but the intention there has always been to bring a cross-section of the audience to sit down and do things. And that being said, I mean, also the nature of the kind of things that get stitched onto it has changed massively over time. In the beginning it was people stitching buttons or Harold Zeman stitching his name into it, whereas now people stitch their business cards into it in the Venice Biennale. So it's taken on another kind of hyper-networking function, but I don't think that nowadays he would connect it to a critique against the Duterte regime. Yeah.
Can I say something? I was really interested, particularly in the way he talks about how that work came into being, the kind of origin stories of it. And it really made me think a lot about the way that Louise Bourgeois sets up a very particular narrative in which is a kind of frame for what you're going to see. You know, there seems to be something really quite similar in that you have this big narrative for work that you then can enter the work through that narrative. And so it's really interesting for me, the connections between how both of them kind of, yeah, they set up these kind of mythic spaces actually before you can do what, you know, before you can encounter the work. For me, that was what was really interesting about trying to approach thinking about the work, not only the thing itself, but the narrative that sets the thing itself.
Do we have any more questions at this one?
Thank you for the presentations and an incredible material that you brought with you too. I think I would like to take this opportunity to ask Sonia and David about something to do with epistemological framework of the project Black Artists and Modernisms. I think it's modernisms, plural. Is it correct, or is modernism?
Singular.
It's singular.
It's singular.
Okay. So, because it seems to me that there's probably what we've seen now with your presentations is more the model of expanding modernism and kind of bringing other textures and practices to the framework. But as you are familiar, I'm sure, modernism in other critical approaches to Western epistemologies and movements is considered to have a direct resonance with colonialism. So I'm here thinking of modernity coloniality specifically, which is a group of scholars from Latin America. So Mignolo is part of it, and Dussel and Vasquez and so on and so forth. So my question is, is just to know a bit from you how you position the project in relation to this critique too, and if the gesture is to expand or to provide different grammars and ways for us to understand other practices.
I'll give a partial answer to that, in that, I mean, particularly if I go back to talking about David Medalla and the Stitch in Time, but not just the Stitch in Time, but the work that he was doing in the 60s and 70s. So this idea of an expanded modernism, well, I mean, I think many people would agree that Live or Live in Your Head was considered a watershed exhibition here in Europe. And David was there. He was in that show. So when one starts to talk about an expanded to where, becomes my question. Because if he was here doing that, then what is it that's being expanded? Or what is it that has somehow slipped the frame? I'm not sure I would call it expansion. I'd probably call it more what has slipped the frame that was happening here and that has happened here. And I would really refute the question, I know we'll come back to it in terms of the plenary, but the question of modernisms. In the same way that I would refute black modernism, Indian modernism, any particular form of modernism. For me, modernism is a set of practices that happened within a certain epoch.
Do you want to add, David, or you?
No, I think it's wrong to say, yeah.
I think there's many things there that we can take into the plenary, actually. I want to thank David, Ava and Sonia for their wonderful papers, and thank you for the